What is the GMAT? Well, it's obviously a test that you've decided to take. Does it actually predict well how you're going to do as an MBA student or in business? Do we care? Right, exactly. My life would be a lot more complicated if I worried about that question. Okay? For better or for worse, it counts a lot toward your admissions application. How much does it count? Does it count for more than 4 years of undergraduate work? Admissions officers generally don't give any kind of percentage on it. But, you know, behind closed doors, I think a lot of them admit, yeah, maybe counts as much as 4 years of undergraduate work.
And yes, it does.
There you go. Thank you, Andre. I don't want to speak out of turn because I'm a specialist in the GMAT, not in admissions, and the LSAT and the GRE. So I'll leave it to Andre to tell you it counts, sure. And our job is very simple, get points. Okay? I don't know if it predicts success. I don't worry about it. So it's supposed to be measuring how you've learned, you know, before in your life to do some kind of verbal reasoning, some kind of math reasoning, analytical reasoning, how well you can write. And so they test you, you know, as often as you like, really, but if you only take it once and you prepare well, you should be set. And then your score is good for 5 years. Okay? And if you don't know what MBA.com is, that's the website you go to. The test is administered by the GMAC, Graduate Management Admissions Council. So you can go to gmac.com or mba.com. It'll redirect you either way, and they'll be happy to take your money. They've got quite a racket going when you think about it. It's a monopoly. Okay, so to get you familiar with the test, right, let's just look basically at the format. You're going to start out with an essay. Half an hour. You won't know what the topic is beforehand. And then they're going to present you with an argument that you're supposed to critique. You know, when we talk about argument, we don't mean a disagreement. Okay, we're not asking you to talk about the great milkshake fight of 1978 between me and my sister. Yeah, that was a good one. But no, they're talking about argument more in the legal sense. The attempt to prove a conclusion, perhaps a recommendation, by the use of some kind of evidence. And so you're meant to think critically the way a lawyer or a consultant would about this conclusion and whether the evidence they presented adequately addresses and supports the conclusion. And I can tell you right away, your opinion is going to be, no, this argument sucks, it's flawed. There are a lot of big gaps. And so then you think about, well, what are the weaknesses in this argument? How can I expose them? And then you have a half hour to write an essay about that. You can choose to take a very critical tone, if you like, and talk about what a moron this person is. Or you might want to take a more constructive tone and say the argument would be more persuasive if it included evidence that links this to that, for example. Okay, so that's your first task, and that comes first on your test day. Next, you're going to do a half hour of what's called integrated reasoning. Now, this is the new section. And many of you probably have goals on the scale of 200 to 800, right? This integrated reasoning is not part of that score. It was just introduced last year. It's scored separately. And there's no real consensus yet about whether admissions officers really care much about this section. I don't know if Andre would care to comment. But what I've heard anecdotally is that thus far, admissions programs are still more interested in your numerical score, 200 to 800. That doesn't mean you should overlook this, but I don't want you to sweat it either. The idea is, can you look at information from multiple sources and synthesize some sort of a critical conclusion? Alrighty, then you get an optional, but I don't know why they call it optional. Of course you're going to take your breaks, stretch, get some blood flow going. Okay, math, 75 minutes of standard multiple choice type questions, right? About 2/3 of those questions are going to be the so-called problem-solving format, and that's what you see here in your handout in the first two questions, you know, A, B, C, D, E. It's basically what you're familiar with, right? But about a third of your questions are going to be this data sufficiency format, which you may not be familiar with, but there's an example of it on question 3. Not to sweat it, the math skills that you need for the problem-solving standard questions are the very same skills you'll need for data sufficiency. It's just a different question format. And during your training, you'll learn what technique to use to approach that format. So there's your math section in a nutshell. Then you get a break again, and then your verbal section, also an hour and a quarter. You'll have to do 3 different question types in your verbal section, all multiple choice, okay, all with 5 answer choices. Reading, well, let's start with critical reasoning since it's first on the slide. Critical reasoning is when you're set up with some sort of a short paragraph. Usually it's going to present you with an argument, not unlike the one in your essay prompt. And your job is to evaluate this argument in some way. Maybe the question will ask you to weaken it, or what's the flaw or assumption that's being made, something like that. But then again, there are some other questions in critical reasoning that aren't really based on arguments. For example, you may be given a paradox and asked which of the answer choices would help to explain the paradox. Or you may be given a business management situation and asked to determine which of the answer choices is the best strategy. Okay? So there are very specific question types, and you can learn techniques for approaching each one of them. In a way, if any of you have been exposed to the law school admissions test, this is a miniature version of the logical reasoning section of that test. Okay, moving on. You'll have sentence corrections where you'll have, and you have examples of these, by the way. Question number 4 was a critical reasoning question. And then question number 5 is sentence correction, where part of the sentence is underlined and may or may not have an error in it. Answer choice A is always going to be the same as the original. So 20% of the time there's no error. But the other 80% of the time there is. And you'll have to choose which answer choice fixes the sentence the best. So it'd be helpful to know some grammar in the English language. And beyond just simple things like subject-verb agreement, it also gets into issues of construction, awkward construction, wordiness, etc. So things that some people might consider stylistic, but are actually considered grammatical on this test. And then finally, reading comp, which you're all familiar with, I'm sure, a passage, several questions on your comprehension of it. Okay, so that's the nuts and bolts of what you're going to do on test A. It's going to be scored 0 to 6 on the essay, and that's reported as a separate score. And then your integrated reasoning section will also be reported separately. It's the 2 big multiple choice sections that are going to be aggregated into your overall score. Okay? So the scale is 200 to 800.